Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all the audience who have dialed in to this Innovation Strategy and Management Masterclass by Professor Rob Wolcott. Brought to you by, of course, the Chicago Booth Alumni Club of Singapore. Rob is an adjunct professor of entrepreneurship in University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He's a technology and innovation expert, serving on digital advisory boards of ZF, Open Innovation Lab of Norway, and HFORM, a digital ecosystem in Italy. Rob is also a regular contributor to Forbes regarding the impact of technology change on business, leadership, and of course, society. He co-founded and serves as the chairman of World Innovation Network, TWIN, a community of innovation leaders from over 30 countries. Rob is also an angel investor in over 20 companies, including Indiegogo, Lumini, and Spy-Ignite. And he's one of the leading lights in the business and innovation world. So we're glad to have him, deliver this innovation strategy and management masterclass to our audience in Asia. He will address, how do we radically accelerate innovation outcomes as part of this course, and how do we deal with the threat of disruption. Some logistics before I hand over to Rob to kick off the class. So the class will run about 50 minutes to an hour. And the audience can ask questions in the Q&A box, and Ritesh will pick up and ask these questions to Rob after the first 50 to 60 minutes. If anyone's very interested in asking a question personally to Rob, please raise your hand. Lenora would actually promote you to be a panelist, and you can ask the question in person. So we're basically covering all our bases for the questions that are going to be asked. So we expect the session to last between 75 to 80 minutes. With that, let me hand over to Rob. Rob, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Rajiv. It's great to be here. Well, I mean, it would be greater to be in Singapore or Hong Kong with you in person, but I so appreciate the invitation, and thanks, Rajiv, for remaining in contact since our class together last year during the pandemic. I appreciate it very much. So first of all, our next hour or so, we can't cover the whole field of innovation strategy and management. So what I thought we'd do is I'll provide a bit of a frame regarding how established enterprises have to think about innovation. And if you're in an established incumbent organization, I'll be speaking to you. But if you're at a startup or a scaling phase company, say like Ritesh is, I'm also speaking to you because you're one of those irritants that comes in that tries to create the new thing, that tries to upend the apple cart and make things new happen. A process that many of us know as creative destruction, which was terminology coined by Joseph Schumpeter. So as any course at Booth should, we'll ground this briefly in that great Austrian-American economist, Joseph Schumpeter. So if you're unfamiliar with Schumpeter's work, I encourage you to at least look him up and find out who he is. He invented the notion of creative destruction, and he also was the first person to use the word entrepreneur the way we use it today. The word was invented by Jean-Baptiste Say, a Frenchman, back in the early 19th century, but he didn't mean entrepreneur the way we do. He meant more investor. Joseph Schumpeter was the one that said that innovation is the only creator of new wealth in the long run in the economy, because everything else is caretaking. Everything else is managing, optimizing a limited pie. So what we're going to talk about today is a brief frame for mostly incumbents and thinking about how to approach change when you're already successful. And then we'll talk about where the world is going, a little bit of foresight about where the world is going across all industries. It's something I call proximity. Something I've been working on for 6 years or so, and a colleague, Kai-Han Krippendorf, and I are actually working on a book right now. So hopefully next year the book will be out. Maybe we can come back together in a year and talk about this notion of proximity. But I'll give you the high-level overview that Rajiv might remember from class. But before I move to screen share, I'd like to explain why I have this burst of orange behind me. This is actually one of my favorite paintings. It's by the English artist Turner. And if you didn't know anything about Turner, you might look at the painting and think that it was painted by an abstract expressionist in the mid-20th century, but it wasn't. It was painted in 1843. And what Turner had in mind when he painted this was, it's called After the Deluge. So he had the Old Testament story of the Great Flood in mind. And why I believe it's relevant to us today, of course, is the pandemic. So while we're not entirely through the pandemic, we have started to understand maybe how to manage it, how to navigate through. There's still an enormous amount of uncertainty, an enormous amount of anxiety, of potential energy, though, wound up like a spring, ready to explode in different and unexpected directions. So when I look at this painting, I see energy, I see uncertainty, I see opacity, but I also see possibilities. And this to me is a lot about what innovation has and brings to our lives. Uncertainty, but also enormous possibilities. So I'd ask you to maybe think about that as we go through this session. So I'm going to screen share now, and let's hope my tech skills are up to the task. Can you, let's see, can you see this? Great. So I modestly refer to this as proximity and the future of all business. Now, as an academic, I was trained never to use a word never, or never to say all, because if someone finds a single example contradictory to what you're proposing, then they've proven you wrong. But I believe this is happening across all industries, and the evidence thus far is bearing this out. And I hope that through this next 50 minutes, you'll agree with me. And if not, happy to hear about it in the Q&A, or maybe feel free to reach out anytime. I'm always active on LinkedIn, and you can always reach me, obviously through Booth as well. So before we move on, a quick plug for a group that Rajiv mentioned, which is the World Innovation Network, or TWIN. This is a group of us meeting in Miami, Florida at the New World Center back in 2016. A lot of what you'll see I've learned from and developed with members of the World Innovation Network. And they're from 30 countries, every sector: business, government, nonprofit, the arts, academia, defense. And we maintain trusted relationships. That's the objective of this small group worldwide. And we say never leave serendipity to chance. So there's my little plug. And a lot of what you'll see is coming from TWIN members. So you're all familiar with this company. You're probably also familiar with all of these companies. All of these companies are on the screen for two reasons. One, they've all had a near-death experience. Some have recovered, some have failed, some are doing well today, but nonetheless, they've all had a near-death experience. Number two, they were also the very best company on the planet and what they did for decades. Literally for decades, they were the gold standard company worldwide. For decades, people around the world would say, if we could just be like Pan Am. That was an airline, by the way. I don't know if you remember them. But the question that intrigued me in my early 20s when I started to think about innovation, entrepreneurship, one of the reasons I wanted to look at incumbent organizations, at big companies, as opposed to entrepreneurs, as much as I love entrepreneurs, is the question, how can this happen? How can you go from being the leading company in the world to near death? And so a lot of what we're seeing in innovation, technology, et cetera, is related to that grand challenge for leaders of incumbent organizations. Now, people often talk about lack of innovation when they talk about this. Often that's not the case. You have to understand what you mean by lack of innovation. I'd say not the right kind of innovation, not the right portfolio of innovation activities in order to remain relevant as the world changes. The essence of innovation strategy is creating and maintaining a portfolio of options on the future. Just like financial management. When you have high uncertainty, you need a portfolio approach, and it's the same thing for innovation. So for instance, back in 1993, when IBM came near death, they had just won a Nobel Prize for inventing the scanning tunneling electron microscope. So clearly there was a lot of innovation going on at IBM and some of these other companies. but it wasn't the right kind of innovation to maintain the success of the enterprise. So how does this occur? Well, people lose sight of the dramatic changes going on in the world, and they misunderstand their role as business leaders. They think their role as business leaders is to optimize what they've been given and eliminate the uncertainty and eliminate the distractions and focus. And while focus is a great and an essential thing, it can go too far. So back in 2018, this gentleman, and by the way, as my students know, I ask for forgiveness because I am not a billionaire, full disclosure, and I will be criticizing some billionaires. So this fellow, Lehman, is a billionaire, pretty successful guy, brilliant guy, I'm sure. But they bought Kraft Heinz in the United States. Pardon me for a second. They bought Kraft Heinz in the United States, a great CPG company, a great American CPG company. And they ripped out all of the center management. They eliminated portfolio optionality. They focused on the core. They drove efficiency. And then what happened? The first few years, enormously successful on the markets. Why is that? Because when you eliminate all of your innovation expenses, it falls immediately to the bottom line. It's like taking crack cocaine because you get an immediate rush of profitability. But then a few years later, you're at great risk of things not going well. Now, in 2018, Lehman was speaking to Milk and Global, an event in LA with a couple thousand people in the audience and also online. And he said, and I still can't believe he said it, we bought brands we thought we could that could last forever. First of all, no brand lasts forever unless it is cared and feeded and amplified and shared. And then he said, you could just focus on being efficient. And then all of a sudden, we're being disrupted. All of a sudden, we're being disrupted. By the way, this stuff never happens all of a sudden. It might feel like it, but these things are always percolating at the edges outside your industry, what I call the peripheries. The new things are out there somewhere, and most of them fail, but some of them will percolate up and become a big deal and change the game. So it's your job as a leader of an organization to have peripheral vision, to see the things on the periphery that might threaten or provide opportunity for your company. And by the way, they burnt through billions of dollars of market value. Fortunately for Kraft Heinz, the last couple of years, they've started to shift. Maybe they've learned some lessons from this. I really do hope they succeed, as Kraft is a great Chicago area company. Now, how do we think about this? So whether we're an incumbent or honestly a scaling phase startup growing quickly, there's fortification and exploration. Fortification is the near-term future of the business, extending and defending the core. This is how we make our money. Exploration is the stuff we have not yet done. Maybe no one's done it, maybe others have, but we haven't. But either way, it's new to us. And the key point, we don't have time to go into detail, but the key point we address throughout my class at Booth is the difference, the fundamental difference between these two operating environments. It takes different processes, different metrics for tracking success, different capital allocation methodologies. These are two completely different environments. And most important for us here today, these tend to be two different kinds of people. The people who love to extend and defend and get the ball bearing perfect off the manufacturing line every time tend to be different and thrive within a different environment than people that seek the future, the people that want to go and discover the value that's out there that we haven't yet found. And so I'd ask you to think about, if you haven't already, which one are you more of? Are you more the fortress or are you more the ship? It'll have a profound impact on the career you build and the happiness you find in the world. So a couple of companies you're probably familiar with. I'm sorry, there's some light on my face because I leave my window open and the sun is pointed right at me. So this is not a technology concept that I've got. It's called the sun. So we've all heard of Amazon, and unfortunately, the sad story of Sears, which, by the way, in the late 19th, early 20th century was the Amazon of the world. But you probably also have heard of this company, Walmart. A lot of people don't know this, but the last 3 or 4 Christmases in the United States, which is the big retail season, the number one online retailer in the United States, we all know this, was Amazon. But the number 2 online retailer, and it was a big delta between the two, but nonetheless, the number 2 online retailer in the United States was Walmart. So it is possible to navigate through fundamental disruption in your marketplaces, but it doesn't happen in a year or two. It happens over a very long period of time. Walmart was already experimenting with e-commerce, with online, with buy online, pick up in store, or what we call today BUPUS. They didn't have a word for it at the time in 2000, 2001, 2002, 20 years ago, when Walmart started to experiment with this. And this is, by the way, is a mark of a great company and great leadership, which is to change before a crisis. Walmart was working on changing before a crisis, and that is a responsibility of senior leadership. And here's another company that, fortunately, for its share owners and in some ways for the world, changed before a crisis, Walt Disney Company. There's a much longer story behind this, and I have enormous respect for Bob Iger. I think he's one of the, I'd recommend his book, by the way. I don't recommend many CEO tell-all books, but his book that came out a year or two ago, I'd highly recommend it. But an interesting wrinkle, they had been experimenting with streaming since 2007 when they originally started to think about this emerging space, and then built ownership in Hulu. And we all know, of course, about Disney Plus, the emergence of Disney Plus, which launched, you might recall, in 2019. So they had been experimenting with it for a while. What a lot of people don't know is that they had been experimenting for some time, and then finally the board of directors said to Iger, look, you've been experimenting, it's looking good, it's time to go big, it's time to launch this. Stop piloting, stop experimenting. And so they did. And I'd like you to reflect briefly on what would have happened to Disney Corporation if they had not fully launched Disney Plus before the COVID pandemic. It would have been a bloodbath. Now, instead, they've navigated through far better than they would have without having launched Disney Plus in late 2019. So having portfolio optionality quite literally saved Walt Disney Corporation, one of the great corporate brands in history. So let's shift to proximity. Where are we going, and how do I know? Well, first of all, things are happening a lot faster. That's almost a trite thing to say because everybody says it now. But let me give you an example. So about 3 years ago, I was speaking to the leadership team of one of the top 3 bond rating agencies in the United States. And there are only 3, so you can take your pick. And they were telling me about innovation SWAT teams that they had created, small groups focused on specific objectives. And by the way, I'm a big fan of that model. We could talk more about that another time if you're interested. But they were sharing with me the various challenges they had given to these SWAT teams. And here was one of them. They said for one of our major products, from the time we sign a contract with a customer to the time we deliver the final product is about 2 months, okay? And this is a bond rating agency. So it's all data, right? Now they said to this team, we need to take that from 2 months to 2 weeks because we know things are moving a lot faster and customers have higher expectations. And I said, wow, that's great. It's certainly a big objective, but here's the problem. What if somebody can do that thing in 2 minutes? When someone can do that same thing in 2 minutes, you've now wasted all of those 6 months of effort to try and bring your cycle time down from 2 months to 2 weeks, because 2 weeks cannot in any way compete with 2 minutes. And when they thought about it, they realized I was right. They realized that in their business, it's all about data, data analytics, compliance, rules. And there is no scenario where sometime in the next 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, we don't know exactly when, but there's no scenario where sometime in the not too distant future, someone will be able to do that in a matter of minutes. So it's an order of magnitude difference. You cannot take in the transitions we're going through right now, and I'll come to that in a second, this notion of proximity, you cannot take your core business and just make a few small changes incrementally, hope to get to where you need to get, because where you need to get is actually over there in a completely different universe. So I'm sure you've all heard of or been even tracking many of these technologies. You can probably even add others. NFTs isn't up here because this slide, I made it 4 or 5 years ago. Things are moving very quickly. Now everyone's paying attention, but very few people have noticed one common underlying dynamic. All of these technologies contribute in the marketplace in various ways. They each allow us to distribute capabilities at smaller and smaller locations all around the economy, ever closer to each moment of demand in time and space. They allow us to distribute sensing, analytics, agency, the ability to make decisions, production, think 3D printing or rooftop solar energy generation. These are all digital or digitally enabled technologies. And because of this distributed nature of digital technologies, the ability to make things smaller and smaller, closer in every moment in time and space, this drives what I call, perhaps immodestly, a unified theory of technology and markets. And that is that digital technologies push the production and provision of value ever closer to the moment of demand. Now, let me say this again, because what I'm not saying is this allows us to move faster or predict demand better. That's certainly true, but that misses the fundamental underlying point. I literally mean that over the rest of our lifetimes, the rest of our careers, the trend across industries will be to push the production and provision of products and services ever closer to the moment at which the demand actually occurs. Now, think about this. I'm actually saying that we will build business systems, design business systems in order to procrastinate. We will design business models in order to wait until the demand is there, until someone says, I'm ready to pay for that. And then you'll do the value add to create the product or service. Think about the enormous opportunities that this provides in terms of eliminating waste, in terms of sustainability, in terms of improved ROI. And like I said, your old platform will not get you here. So I'll give you an example. We all know Amazon. They've been doing something for a while called anticipatory shipping. With anticipatory shipping, we all know that they're watching everything you're searching for, and Alibaba does the same kind of thing. All these services around the world are watching what we're searching for, what we're clicking on, how long we're spending on a page. We call this cursor hover time or digital drooling. And they're using this to predict what you'll buy. And so they'll see a product that you are going to buy. Rajiv is going to buy that tennis racket that his wife told him not to buy. But Amazon knows that Rajiv is going to buy that tennis racket. So they send the tennis racket to the distribution center near his house before he's ordered the product. Now, understand, I did not say they're going to send 144 tennis rackets to the distro center because they think that next quarter that will be a really big product. They're going to send the exact tennis racket that Rajiv wants to the distro center near his house because they're pretty darn sure he's going to order it. And they've been doing this for over 4 years now. Do you think they're getting better at it? Now, it's much bigger than this. Let's continue on the physical product line because this also relates to services, for instance, and data, but let's continue on physical products. Today, we have a global supply chain optimized for scale manufacturing at a distance. The larger your plant, the lower your costs. Not always true, but for the most part, true. Over our lifetimes, this model will be ripped apart and transformed. The global supply chain will become what I call hybridized. So in 30 years, we'll still have large plants in Southeast China, Mexico, US, Germany, Japan. Of course we will, when it makes economic sense. But we'll also have smaller plants nearer to demand. We're already seeing this with reshoring and automation. There are some great examples out there, new businesses like Arrival, which is making electric commercial vehicles, and they can take over a very small warehouse and very quickly end up with a production facility right near demand. And we're going to start to see production capabilities in neighborhoods and urban areas. And eventually, not yet, it's not ready yet, but eventually on your counter in your kitchen at home. Think about how hard it is to buy one matching metal fork. It turns out it's really hard to buy one matching fork. How do you buy one matching fork? Well, Somebody in Western Australia mines iron ore. They put it on a ship. They send it to Southeast China. They melt it down, alloy it, send it to another plant. They make 12 forks. Then they put 12 forks into a box, onto a pallet, into a ship. They send it across the ocean to a port, into a train or a truck, and into a store. And I buy 12 metal forks. Today, it is technologically trivial. We cannot do it because the infrastructure does not yet exist. To download a file, press a button, and print one matching fork. Over our lifetimes, this technology will rapidly become better and better, and it's not going to happen right in the middle of your market right away. We're not going to be 3D printing cars next year at scale. People are already working on that. It's not ready yet. It'll take a long time. But in the United States, 25% of all plastic replacement parts for automotive cost more to ship than they do to manufacture. So it stands to reason there will be situations where it is far more efficient, economically efficient and responsive to use 3D printing. And those instantiations, those examples will start to percolate in the markets, in the economy, and some of them will succeed and rise up and change the game. This is where everything is going. Now, this is our old view of competition. You've all seen this kind of thing before: Pepsi, Coke, FedEx, UPS, et cetera, fill in the blank. We all know that's an antiquated way to look at competition. Here's another way to look at it. This is from CB Insights. It looks at all of the startups, some incredibly well-funded, some have failed since. This slide's perhaps 5 or 6 years old, and how they relate to the various services and value propositions that FedEx brings to market. This is a good way to track some of the things that might be relevant to your business in the marketplace. Companies you need to be worried about, companies you need to track, companies you might want to invest in as a corporate venture capitalist, or maybe even acquire or partner with. But even this isn't quite broad enough to encompass all of the changes and opportunities going on. We need to take an ecosystem view. We need to look at the broader picture of all the things going on, not just for our own services and products, but for our customers, our suppliers, and even our customers' customers and our suppliers' suppliers. So I'll give you an example. About 7 or 8 years ago, a friend of mine, Rick Smith, and his colleagues founded a company at the time called Cloud DDM. They knew that 3D printing was going to be something important, so they started a 3D printing company. They went to UPS in Louisville, Kentucky, and they said, you have a warehouse across the alley from your global distribution center. We'd like to take over that empty warehouse and install 100 3D printing machines. And at the time, 6 years ago, they were just printing little plastic things. Today, they're into metal and other kinds of products as well. They said, we'd like to install these 3D printing machines, and then we're going to take orders for single unit product needs from customers, or maybe they need 12 units of a particular product, or maybe they need 57 units of something. Not a very big run, and so you can't hire a factory to tool up to make 57 copies of something very efficiently, but 3D printing, it works great. And so UPS said, absolutely, not only is it a great idea, we want to invest in it. So UPS invested in Cloud DDM, which eventually became Fast Radius. And if you look them up, you'll find out they're doing incredibly well right now. Now, UPS did not invest in Fast Radius because they thought, oh, let's leave our logistics business and go build a 3D printing company. That's not why they invested. They invested to seed the market in an emerging space in a way that would benefit their business long run. Because if more and more people are ordering small runs of products through 3D printing closer and closer to demand, then UPS's logistics capabilities become even more important, and they're a natural customer and partner. And on Fast Radius's side, imagine having a partner like UPS to take care of all of the logistics and fulfillment in the marketplace. So these are the kinds of experiments we need to seek out in the marketplace. And remember, as you do, that true breakthroughs do not happen by doing the things we've done before a little better. They happen by doing what we could never have done before. And this is a trap that a lot of incumbent companies end up in. And the trap is they see the new technologies. It's not that they don't see them. They're not stupid. They see these things in the market and they immediately ask, how can we use this new technology to be better at what we already do? Now, that's a really good question. Please keep asking it, but that's not enough. You also have to ask, what can this new technology allow us to do that we could never have done before? So this is a company called Uncork. I'm a huge fan. I met the fellow, Gary Hoberman, the founder, back in 2017, because I just published an article in Quartz that was intended to be provocative, intended to cause people some anxiety. And I basically said that in the future, later on this century, knowing how to code computers, code would be like knowing ancient Greek. Really impressive, very important for very specific applications in the academy, very detailed applications, but not for anybody else, because eventually computers will essentially code themselves for most purposes, or they'll be able to interact with us in our natural languages to do what it is we need to do. Now, when I published this article, I got lots of negative comments, people saying, you have no idea what you're talking about. Have you ever coded anything in your life? I have actually, but I don't like it, but I have done some coding. And this guy is an idiot, right? As you might guess. But I also got a lot of responses saying things like, yeah, you know, that's where the world's going. It's been going that direction slowly at first since the 1950s and 60s when we started to code systems in zeros and ones. And one of the fellows that contacted me was Gary Hoberman. Gary was the chief information officer of MetLife, a big insurance company in the US, and he had just left his job to start Uncork. Uncork is a leader in the no-code movement. The no-code movement means his platform, and there are others, allows someone who has no idea how to code, and in this case, it's for enterprise applications. It allows someone in an enterprise who knows their business, who knows what they want software to do, but they have no idea how to code. It allows them to go in and create an application, and the computer codes itself. And it allows them to do this in a matter of weeks or even days. Now, at the time in 2017, a lot of people said, you know, Gary, that sounds great, but he couldn't find any funding. He couldn't get people to fund this. And so he self-funded it for a bit. And then within a year, he had funders like Google and Goldman Sachs. And then at the end of last year, in October of 2020, they completed a Series C round with a $2 billion valuation. The company is growing dramatically. And here's a kicker. Their core customers are insurance companies and banks. It doesn't get more rigorous than insurance companies and banks for enterprise-grade applications. So if they can do this for insurance companies and banks, think about who else they can do this for. Now, how does this relate to proximity? Well, think about it. If you're a business leader, if you're running a function at a company and you need a piece of software, you think, you go to the IT department or you go to an outside provider and you talk about what you think you might want, and they go off and do a business requirements document, and then a technical requirements document, and then they get sign off, and then they go off and they build something, or they find a third-party provider of it, and they come back, and then you say, that's not what I wanted. It's a classic story. We've all been there. But now with something like Uncork, I can bring this capability ever closer to the moment of demand. To the people in the business who need applications, they can actually create and pilot them themselves. And if they work, they can scale them up. It's a fundamentally different way to look at IT and software. So as proximity ascends, customer expectations rise dramatically. I'm sure you've already seen it as a consumer. You expect a lot better service. So in your business life, you start to expect that level of service as well. Prediction actually becomes a lot more possible at lower risk when you build a business system that allows you to wait until doing value add. You actually have lower risk because the demand is manifesting right as or right before you start to produce the product or service. The trade-off between customization and scale starts to fade. And this is very exciting. Waste dramatically declines. And I'll have an example of this near the end when we talk about the pharmaceutical industry. the notion of waste. Think about the sustainability implications of proximity. So I don't have time to go into this in detail now, but this will be a core part of our book, which we're working on now. It should come out next year, about proximity strategy. Think ecosystems, like we talked about, because ecosystems are colliding and new entrants, not just startups, but Amazons and Googles and Alibabas of the world are moving into spaces they hadn't been in before. You need to start to think about how to track points of demand always and everywhere. What does it mean to understand and track the potential demand from your customers or even your customers' customers always and everywhere? What does that mean, and how do we do it? Because of the distributed capabilities of digital technologies, we need to start to think about how we compress, I mean, literally physically compress and distribute and synchronize value production around the world closer to your customers or potential customers. And how do we do the same thing for the provision of those products and services, the service of those products and services, and then building robust, evolvable systems. I'm going to digress on evolvables for a second because it's not an obvious point. As a result of the pandemic, everybody talks about resilience. Resilience sounds like a great thing, but I'm actually not the biggest fan of the term resilience, because the academic definition of it, and this comes from complexity theory, the academic definition of resilience is a subset of robustness. A robust system is one that can persevere through external shocks. The more robust the system is, the better it can persevere through external shocks. And the specific case of resilience, what it suggests is that system can be shocked from the outside, an exogenous shock, and make it through the same as it was before. But that's not really what we want. What we really want is evolvability. We want robustness and evolvability, the ability to experience a pandemic and come out the other side better, the ability to face a disruptive technology in the marketplace and navigate through better. That's really what we want. So think about the evolvability of a Tesla or of any electric vehicle, the way they do, instead of a product recall where they have to call all the vehicles in to replace a physical part, a lot of them happen through software updates that occur in the middle of the night. So think about the evolvability of this, and think about the capabilities that having those batteries in the vehicle can provide. Right now, the Ford F-150 pickup, which if you've ever been to the center of America, you know it's the dominant vehicle, consumer vehicle. The new electric pickup has such battery power that they're looking at how to use it as an automated backup for homes, electrical backup for homes. Talk about new applications and evolvability provided by these new platforms. So one question, if you're running a legacy organization, an incumbent, especially if it's very successful, but one question you need to ask is, to what extent can we leverage our legacy? And to what extent do we need to build new? It's not always the case that we should throw out the old thing or marginalize the old thing and just focus on the new. If you've got something that's making money, you've got to continue to shepherd it and protect it and extend it, but also evolve it. But there are cases where you really do need to just throw out or transition, sunset the old and build the new. One of my favorite examples of this, and I call this approach a transitional business platform. You can find an article I wrote about this in the Harvard Business Review maybe 5 or 6 years ago. You can find it online. We don't have time to go into detail, but a transitional business platform is one that allows you to get into the market now with something somewhat new that works now, but you have a vision for where the future will go in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. You know it's going to go there, or you're pretty sure, but you can't go there yet because the customers aren't ready, the technology isn't ready yet, the bandwidth doesn't exist, whatever it is. And my favorite example of this is Netflix. When Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph founded Netflix in the 90s, they wanted to do what we today call streaming, but they couldn't because the bandwidth didn't exist. The content providers weren't interested in going along for that. The public couldn't do it. So rather than giving up, they decided, we're going to build a business we can make work today. We're going to send DVDs through the mail and build a brand, build presence, build a customer base. And then when the world is ready, when it shifts and streaming becomes a thing, we'll be the one ready to win. And they did. So they recognized they had to build something very new in order to leverage this streaming space in the long run. And they had to do it in a transitional fashion. But there are other cases where you can take your incumbent, your very successful business, your capabilities, your installed base, whatever it is, and build on top of it and build the future. So one of my favorite examples of this is a company based in Wisconsin called Generac. Now, you might not have heard about it if you're not from North America, but it's in many ways should be just a really boring old company, but it's not. It's one of the most exciting, in my opinion, in the market. You can look it up. It's publicly traded. They make and have for years backup generators. So it's a generator that goes in your house or your small business, and you plug it into a gas line, a natural gas line. And if the power goes off, then the generator turns on and you don't lose all the food in the refrigerator, right? Very boring old product. Well, a while back, 4 or 5 years ago, new leadership at Generac said, you know what? We need to keep being great at that. But if we're still doing that in 10 years, we're in trouble and we're not going to get the growth we need. So we need to become the leader, the world leader in distributed energy resource management. Distributed energy resource management, because they saw that solar and wind and other kinds of energy production are being distributed at smaller and smaller locations around the economy. Rather than huge centralized generation plants, we'll start to see small production capabilities closer to demand on people's homes or businesses. And they said, we want to build the platforms in order to enable that. So it's a long story, and I encourage you to look it up, but they've done an extraordinary job of it, and they have big plans for the future. I'll give you one example. Last year, they bought a software company based in Canada called Enbala. And what Enbala does is it provides the software platform for managing distributed energy resources. And they've combined that with their installed base at Generac and their new products. So one of the things they can do now with this new software platform, you buy a Generac generator, you plug it in just like you would. But if you use this software platform, in many parts of the United States, if you generate additional energy through solar or wind or a generator, anything, the electric utility system is required to buy that power from you if you have excess power. And as we all know, power prices go up and down widely based on immediate demand. So there are spikes in demand. And so what Enbala's technology does, one of the things that it does, is it tracks the market price for power at any given moment. And then it calculates the moment where it is more efficient to turn on the generator, produce power, and sell it back to the grid. And then as market prices come down, it then automatically shuts off the generator and thus providing a revenue source to the homeowner or to the business owner. Now, this is just one small example of proximity, of distribution of capability, the production of power, and Generac taking their very traditional business and transforming it into a platform for the future. I expect very big things from Generac. And if you look at their share price, you'll find that a lot of other people do as well. Now, I'm coming down to the end of my prepared remarks so that we can get to some Q&A. And again, I'm happy to connect with any booth alums via LinkedIn or after this. But when I start to think about the future and think about a model like proximity or others, one of the things I like to do is I like to take the idea we're talking about and say, are there situations, environments where that just can't work? Or maybe if it's going to work, it's not going to work for decades. I mean, this is just too hard, right? And so one of the first places I thought about was, well, what about pharmaceuticals? Pharmaceuticals, there's a life or death angle to this. It has to be high quality. It has to be perfect. If it's not, people die. the regulators shut you down. So could we really do pharmaceuticals close to demand, the actual production of drugs close to demand? Now, meanwhile, for Booth Exec Ed, last year I was facilitating a session with a group from Genentech, and they were talking about personalized medicine. And these are a whole range of technologies and methodologies where, for instance, you look at the genetic makeup of an individual, and you pharmacogenomics, it's called, and you try and target specific kinds of drugs to this individual as opposed to that individual. It's much bigger than that, but that's one example. So if you think about it, the ability to personalize and customize therapeutics for each individual requires us to take new approaches to producing pharmaceutical drugs, requires us to not be dependent on the massive production facility hundreds or thousands of miles away from demand. So how do we deal with this transition? Well, here's a company that exists today called OnDemand Pharmaceuticals. I encourage you to look it up, and we have a great video from Twin Global 2018 of the founder, Dr. Jeffrey Ling. So Dr. Ling was with the US military. He was a colonel in the Army as a medical doctor. He also practices medicine at Johns Hopkins University Medical Center in Baltimore. But he was in Iraq and Afghanistan for 6 tours of duty, and often they would have drug shortages in the field. And by the way, in the United States, we have drug shortages at hospitals around the country, including Johns Hopkins, one of the top hospitals in the world. They have drug shortages for various generic drugs. And so he was trying to figure out the problem where everybody else would look at the supply chain and how do we get more into storage. Dr. Ling said, you know what, why don't I just make it right here myself? Synthetic chemistry, and I'm not talking about biotech, that's different, although they are working on that too, and they're making great progress on it. Synthetic drugs, synthetic chemistry-based drugs, are made of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, pretty basic stuff. And so guess what? They did it. The equipment you see in the center was from about 18 months ago. That's the size of a small refrigerator. And that can produce 14 different classes of drugs. One example would be ciprofloxacin. So the fluoroquinolone antibiotic, many of you have probably taken it. If you need 100 doses of ciprofloxacin, you push a button, you wait a bit, and it'll give you 100 doses of ciprofloxacin made on site. Now, start to think about how this cascades across the economy and the new value propositions you can provide. You can eliminate drug shortages in many places. You can take this thing to places that don't have access to generic drugs, like in the middle of Africa or some parts of Asia where they don't have the generic drugs. But you can take a piece of equipment like this and fill it with what? Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and create these drugs. Now, in the United States, and I know this is true in Singapore and other places, we have stockpiles of drugs in case of, for instance, biological attacks. So the United States has millions of doses of ciprofloxacin, and it's not just for ciprofloxacin. There are hundreds of other drugs that this can create. But to use ciprofloxacin as an example, we have millions of doses of ciprofloxacin in storage right now in the United States in case of anthrax attacks or other kinds of public health emergencies. Now, as you might guess, every few years, we have to take those drugs, we have to throw them out and make new ones. Now, what about a system like OnDemand Pharmaceuticals? What is the shelf life of carbon? Forever. It fundamentally changes. Waiting to do the value add until the demand is present fundamentally changes the economics, the dynamics, the supply chain, the sustainability of our systems worldwide. And this is where we're going. So I ask you to consider in your industries, in your businesses, maybe the startups you're thinking about pursuing, like Ritesh and his robo-advisor industry, which is definitely a manifestation of proximity. How might proximity relate to your industry and where you might be going in your career? I'd like to conclude, as I do all of my classes at Booth, and that is with a quick reflection on purpose. Why? Human beings grow, they're motivated by a sense of purpose. Organizations are motivated by a sense of purpose, far more than anything else, and the research about this is profound. So our job is to figure out what does it mean to have purpose in the context of our business or our lives personally? And additionally, human beings grow through challenges. Organizations grow through challenges. It's nice and fun when everything's going well and we're making money. We learn a little bit, but we truly learn and grow when we face adversity, when we face challenges, when we rise to them, or even if we fail to rise to them, it is in so trying that we grow. So the challenge we all face as leaders is to identify the challenges and pose them to our teams before the marketplace does it to us, because it will. Thanks so much for your time, and I'm eager to take some of your questions and get out of this stupid slide share mode.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Wolcott. We've started getting some really good questions, so I'll start picking them up. But just for everyone's understanding, if you do want to pose a question directly to Professor, just raise your hand so we can get you to come forward and speak directly as well. So please don't feel shy. In the meantime, let's look at some of the questions that have been posted. I guess the first one that comes in from Rachel is on advice on convincing senior management in terms of innovation itself, right? Because creating new solutions when client demand for that new solution or products and services had not yet manifested or materialized. Like, how do you, convince the senior management to take that step forward?
That is a fabulous question, and it's a challenge that we'll all face in our careers, especially at an incumbent organization that has been doing what it does for a long time and makes money at it. It's very hard to make the case. So a couple of thoughts. It's a much bigger discussion than this, but a couple of thoughts. First of all, you're not going to do it if it's truly new. You're not going to do it with a slide deck and an Excel spreadsheet in the meeting room. There are going to be lots of reasons why they're not going to pay much attention to that. You've got to find other ways. A second, and you need to do that too, perhaps, but you've got to find other things. A second observation is never a prophet in your own land. Now, this is not something we can fix. You can't buy a self-help book or a culture change book and fix this. This is so ingrained into human beings, into human societies, that it's in the Bible, literally. There's never a prophet in your own land. Now, what do I mean by this? Have you ever had the experience where you've been trying to tell your colleagues at work something, we need to do this, this is a problem, we need to do this. You've been trying to tell them for months and no one's listening, no one's getting it. And then somebody comes in from the outside, maybe a professor from Booth or some executive from another company comes in and says the same thing you're saying. And then your colleagues say, oh my gosh, she's right, we need to do that. And you think, wait a minute, I've been saying this for 6 months. Okay, hold on, take your ego out of it. The end justifies the means. What are your objectives? You need to stand back then and say, oh my goodness, she is right. We need to do that. That's because that person, and it can't just be any crazy person. It has to be someone that the leadership might actually listen to and might respect. So a senior executive from a non-competing company in an analogous industry, perhaps, or an expert in a field where they'll say, you know what, I think I should listen to Ritesh because he seems like he should really know what he's doing. You need to bring somebody in from the outside. And then a third thought I'll share with you, you have to have, and this is for everybody on the call, everybody needs to have a couple of customers, even if you're not in sales or marketing or customer facing, even if you're not, you need to, for your career, you need to find a couple of customers that you can get to know well enough and have trust with that you can call them when you have a new idea and have a conversation, have a confidential conversation about it. Now, if you get serious about this thing, then you need to work with one or two of those customers behind the scenes in small ways with small budgets to iterate on stuff. Because I'll tell you, if you end up with a customer that's important to your business that has been on the journey with you for a few months or a year or whatever it is, and they really like what you're doing, then you set up a meeting with your boss or maybe your boss's boss if you're able to, and bring that customer in. And if that customer says, hey, I love what we're doing here and I want a lot more of it, then minds start to shift because they're hearing it directly from their customers. So just a few thoughts.
Awesome. That was great, Rob. So one interesting question that I see from Jackie is, do you agree that many of great business decisions were actually made through accidents? And with hindsight, we may associate it to unified theory, but were they all accidents, right? So second question from the same person is,
well, let me address that first, because it's
right.
actually we could talk about that for hours, but I'll give you a couple of brief thoughts. First of all, a lot of strategy is defined ex post facto. What I mean is what people feel like, and often that they're not lying, they just feel like this was the thing. They had a strategy, they went out and they executed on it, and it was a big success. And sometimes that's true, but often that's not. Often what happens is they have a strategy, they go out and try it, it's not quite working. They try this other thing, it's not quite working, but this other thing starts to work, and they go, oh, well, let's do more of that. And then that works out and it becomes big. And then they look back and they say, well, that must have been our strategy. So a lot of strategy is defined ex post facto, but you can find examples and you can document them where someone had a vision, or someone said, this is how we're going to take this thing to market, or this is the thing we're going to create. And they went through the process and it actually worked out. And keep in mind, there's a difference between vision, something I want to create in the future, something I want to see happen in the future, and strategy. They're different. You can have the vision, but experiment with various approaches to making it happen, right? And the Netflix example is a good one, because I've actually done the research and validated, this is very well documented. Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph were very clear about where they wanted to go. They wanted to create a company that could stream any video anywhere at any time, but they couldn't do it at the time. So they created an alternative approach, DVDs by mail, a business which still exists, by the way. They've tried to sell it, but they couldn't because it's sunsetting. But boy, because all their customers are dying, they tend to be very old people, but it's very high margin. So they take those margins and they throw them into the new stuff. So it is often the case, you're right, but it's not always the case. There are cases where people had a vision, they promulgated it, and they created the future. So what's the second question?
So the second question is on, how much value do you give to experience? Today's businesses, as they're becoming more and more agile and faster, isn't it also because people are leveraging on past experience, past mistakes of others, and becoming agile?
Absolutely. So here's the trick. Experience is essential. Expertise is essential. But when you're facing change, you have to recognize when the expertise actually gets in the way, when the expertise limits our ability to see the new and to deal with the new. Because think about it, experts become experts by becoming expert at what we've already done. And so it limits in many ways their ability to see the new things that follow a brand new paradigm. Now, there are exceptions. There are some people who can think beyond the dominant paradigms. There aren't really that many, but there are some. So one of the things we can do as a manager, as a leader, is we can say, okay, I want to keep the experts because I need them, but I also need to find experts in other things, in other environments, in other industries, and I need to bring them into the problem to come up with some new solutions, to think about this in new ways. So this is a challenge of expertise. Also, taking some new people who bring very new perspectives is great. There's a lot of power to naivete, but if you only have that, I think, and I haven't done the research to show the data, but if you only have that, one would guess that the successes would be more to do with luck and chance than it would be because they were doing something, really smart. But we can all think of examples of people who are completely naive, who created a new paradigm. My favorite one would be Michael Dell. He had no experience at all. He started Dell Computer Corporation in his dorm room when he was an undergrad. And of course, he transformed the industry. But it's a telling case because over time he realized that there were a lot of things he didn't know how to do that he needed, like he needed supply chain. They, early on in the history of Dell Computer Corporation, they had huge problems with their supply chain, with product quality. So being a smart leader, even at a young age, he said, you know what? I don't understand supply chain. I'm going to get this other guy in. I think his name was Rollins. He does know supply chain. He has experience. He can fix this for us and make it work. And he did. So I think it has to do with bringing naivete, new perspectives, different kinds of expertise together, and not only relying on the experts who've been around for a long time.
Great. Some really interesting questions coming up here. So this is
now, actually, Ritesh, there's one question here that I think you should probably answer. It's from Ian. He's in Singapore and he wants to know where he can buy a Chicago booth T-shirt.
Ian, I will check in with you separately.
Okay,
yes,
that's really important. That's merchandising. I mean, you want to support the school, so buy a T-shirt.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so this is really interesting. So it's an anonymous attendee, but he asked about, we spoke about positive proximity. Can you talk about negative proximity, like, you know, drugs available and closer to demand may have negative externality to it?
Very, very insightful question. So to every solution, there are new problems. Drugs could be one. Designer drugs, download a file, produce that new drug anywhere. Another example that is rather threatening in the United States because of our regime is firearms and guns that can be 3D printed. And that, honestly, that capability will be increasingly present. All technologies, as we know, are simply tools and they could be used for good or ill. And I would say that one person's good is another person's ill, potentially. So yes, these things will be followed by enormous ethical, societal questions, challenges that we should be socializing right now. To give you an example, maybe a glimmer of hope. So artificial intelligence is a big factor here, right? Because artificial intelligence can do increasingly powerful things, and we might wonder whether they'll become outside the control of human beings. Now, as an aside, I'm not sure that having human beings controlling things necessarily makes everything safe. I think we have millions of years of data that suggests that's not true, but we still feel the threat of releasing extraordinary capabilities to the machine. And so here in the United States, and it's a global, attempting to create a global movement, there's an investor in the AI space named Manoj Saxena, an entrepreneur investor. He's a big figure in the artificial intelligence space. He was one of the early leaders of Watson at IBM, but that's because IBM bought a startup he started and he spent a few years with them in the early days. But he's built other companies. He has a venture fund, and he started something called the Responsible AI Institute, or RAI. And their mission is to understand what are the responsibilities and methodologies that we should be following as businesses to protect ourselves from a liability perspective, and doing the right thing, being able to prove to the authorities that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing to protect consumers, customers, stakeholders, et cetera, being compliant with the law. And so the Responsible AI Institute is an example of the kind of activity coming out of private sector into an NGO structure, and one example of the kind of activity we need to see more of. And so I thank whoever sent in the question. I thank you for thinking about that.
Great. This next one is from Craig. He asks about Intel versus Google. So the question is, Intel disrupted itself successfully, like through memory, microprocessors, phones. Google hasn't done that, you know, in ads, like, will they?
Single company prognostications. I'll point out that Intel was able to make some of those transitions, but we all know that Intel did not make some of the more recent transitions, and this is why they're going through some wrenching change right now. I think they'll make it through. It would be hard to imagine a company as powerful as Intel with a great new leader. I mean, he really is making some great decisions. The team is moving the company. You never know until it's done. But, you know, they entirely missed the GPU revolution that has enabled NVIDIA to become one of the greatest companies. I'm going to propose one of the greatest companies in history. I don't think anybody is as far along as NVIDIA in that space. And that's an example where that would have been Intel's to lose, and they lost it. In terms of Google, I'm not sure, but I will point out that if you'd asked me a decade ago, we all would have agreed that Google is what we used to call a one-trick pony. You know, in America, we call it a one-trick pony. So it's got only one trick. But as my colleague from Kellogg's, Mohan Sani, says, they're a one-trick pony, but it's a pretty damn good trick, right? Making a ton of money, phenomenal market position, margins, et cetera. That was a decade ago. They're still doing that. But what are they also in? And they were a little bit slow to this. Cloud. But Google Cloud they're becoming, you know, one of the big three in the US, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, and Google. So they're growing in that space, and some others. So I'm not entirely sure, but I know that they have an extraordinary portfolio of options in the future. If anything, their challenge has been their portfolio has been so broad, and they have so much money, they're at risk of throwing too much money at lots of stuff just to see what will stick. And by the way, they can do that. Most companies cannot do that and should not do that. The reason Google can do that is that they're literally playing with monopoly money. And I mean that quite literally. So they can afford to invent self-driving cars and throw balloons into space. And so I wouldn't count them out. I think they have, my guess is that they'll still be a powerful company in 5 or 7 years. Who knows? But I think that given the power of their platform and their market position, given their growth in cloud, which is going to see many years of continued growth, I think that they'll be able to transition in addition to online advertising. In terms of disrupting that core with programmatics and other things like this, that remains to be seen. I think they have the opportunity to be the leader in disrupting that because of their market position and their platform.
Great. So, Professor,
and by the way, Ritesh, I'll continue to do this until you shut me off. So I'm happy.
I was just going to ask you, like, you know, we are 10 minutes past 9 here in Singapore. So potentially 5 more minutes, if you don't mind.
Sure. Sounds great.
All right, great. So I'll try to also combine a few questions if possible, so that we cover as much as possible of all the things that we see right now. So one is, I guess, on strategic obstruction when it comes to innovation. Like, you know, a lot of litigation regulations come into play, and these are sort of long established means to defeat innovation in a way, right? So how do you sort of get around that? Also, in certain, I think, platforms and certain industries, it's a very long drawn process of, you know, NDA signing, and, you know, it takes months and months to complete those processes before you can really scale up quickly, right? Like, you know, so how do you solve for dynamics such as these?
Well, they're different around the world in different contexts. I hate to say it, but in many ways it depends. I mean, I see the question from Jim here about NDAs in Japan. So regarding facing potential litigation, this is something that all entrepreneurs have to worry about, but you can't let it stand in the way of progress. In cases where there's a high cost of regulation or high barriers to entry from things like regulation and potential litigation, the standard approach would be to go and try and find a well-funded incumbent partner that can run out ahead and that has the resources to deal with litigation. So an example of this would be the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. Even very well-funded biotechs end up having to partner and actually aspiring to partner with a large pharma company because they bring the engine to market, they bring the compliance, they bring the well-funded, overfunded legal team. So it depends. It'd be very different if you're talking about online gaming, creating an online game from your studio in Tallinn, Estonia, and throwing it up and seeing if people use it and it scales. So it depends very much on the context. In a context like Japan, I mean, I have great love for that environment. Our partner at Twin is the Japan Innovation Network. I've spent quite a bit of time in Japan, was a visiting professor at Keio Business School many years ago in 2002 and 2005. But it is a particular environment for trying to innovate and be an entrepreneur. So if someone's really interested in that, I would recommend they go talk to the team at Japan Innovation Network. It's a nonprofit. It's been around for, gosh, over a decade now. And they do fantastic work with corporates, some entrepreneurs, government. They understand the environment. And one of the things I've seen, by the way, is in a complicated space is you sometimes want to consider how to start something somewhere else and get traction and then bring it in. But not always, not always. There's a company in Japan called Cash, like cash. They're growing really fast, a payments platform. They saw what happened in other countries with, say, for instance, PayPal or Stripe, Square, and said, you know, we need to figure out what that looks like in Japan. And they're gunning for a major IPO. So it can happen anywhere in the world, but the conditions are somewhat different, and you have to know your market. So if somebody's interested in connecting with our partners at the Japan Innovation Network, please contact me on LinkedIn, and I'll make an introduction.
Awesome. I think let's take one more, and again, I'll try and combine, I think a lot to do with innovation, right? Like, you know, how do you define or talk about disruptive innovation in general, innovation in education, things around like, what will be the next economy be? Like, is it token-based AI? How do you think about it? I think a lot of, you know, things put together, but I'll let you address.
Well, so great. So regarding disruption, I encourage everybody, as I do in my class, I encourage everybody to read Clay Christensen, and it was actually by Bauer and Christensen, B-O-W-E-R and Christensen, Clayton Christensen's original article in Harvard Business Review. I think it was 93 or 95, something like that, about disruptive innovation. And I encourage you to read it and think about what he's really saying, what disruption really is, because people will take anything that looks new and throw it into disruptive. And most new things are not disruptive technologies or disruptive business models. It's really important to know the difference, because you have to handle disruptive things differently than other kinds of innovation. So that's the first thing I'd say. And really challenge yourself to understand what it actually is, rather than just saying, oh, that's new, so it's disruptive. The second thing I'd say, there's a question here about understand proximity. I've mentioned it in a couple of articles in Harvard Business Review online in the past 5 or 6 years. There's an article in Forbes called The Future of All Business, you know, very modestly titled The Future of All Business. I wrote about proximity there, specifically with respect to manufacturing and in the automotive industry, but it applies beyond that. So you can track that. In terms of disruption, make sure you don't overuse the term. Make sure you're the one executive in the room that really understands the difference between disruptive innovation and other kinds of innovation, because you'll be more effective at thinking through the challenge and the opportunity.
Awesome. So I guess, like, you know, just to wrap it up, will be great. I think, again, one more question from our audience, like, what's the best way for us to stay in touch with you, Professor, and understand more about proximity?
Well, first of all, I've already mentioned LinkedIn. I use it. You can contact me on LinkedIn. Feel free to contact me through booth email, but honestly, because I'm an adjunct professor, I don't often check my booth email when I don't have a class going on. So use my Twin Global email, rwolcott@twinglobal.org, and reach out anytime. Ritesh, Rajiv, Lenora, if someone asks for my email, feel free to give it to them. And a quick post note, Mark mentioned Star Trek. I'm a huge fan, and Mark, you have correctly asserted that Star Trek is far better than Star Wars, and any good sci-fi fan should know that. So hats off to you. Yeah, I mean, think about the notion of visionary in terms of the replicator or in terms of the tricorder, right? But what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about those things to me is they were visionary, but it's stuff that we all want, right? We all want what we want, when we want, where we want it. We want it for free, but so that's hard to deal with. But the replicator was an obvious thing to say, how about something where if I want a steak dinner, I push a button and it creates a steak dinner? Of course I would want that. And guess what? Sometime in the future, technology will enable that. We can't do it yet, but sometime in the future it will. So I'm a huge fan of tracking science fiction to imagine where we're going in the future, because by the way, every experience, everything we navigate in the world comes originally from imagination.
Awesome, great. So thank you again, Professor. This was a wonderful session. I think all the folks who have joined today, I'm seeing a lot of these positive comments, like this has been an outstanding session. People want to know more about this. They want to get references to some of the articles and stuff that you mentioned. And like, we are recording this, so essentially it'll, just reach out to us from an organization standpoint. So we will help you, get some of those resources to look up and all. But in any case, like, Professor is available to connect directly as well. So please feel free to connect as well. Once again, thank you so much, Professor. It's been a pleasure spending time early in the morning with us. So,
or late in the evening, I guess.
Yeah, so I also want to thank everyone who was part of this organization. So the whole Alumni Club of Singapore, Rajiv, Kaji, Lenora for setting it all up. As part of this, we will continue to do more of these events in the near future. So please look up upcoming events in the month of November. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to having you again.
Oh, thanks so much, Ritesh. I'm happy to be here and would be great to be in Singapore with you at some point. But I'll just underscore congrats to everybody who came, and I'm thankful for that. But work hard to stay in touch with each other. Work hard to build and maintain the booth network, because that's as much, and truth be told, sometimes more value even than what you learn from the faculty. This life's a journey, and it's a lot better together. So thanks so much for setting this up.
Thank you so much, Professor. Have a restful day. Thank you.
Cheers. You too. Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.